Okay. So we can start flipping those. We have to give these birds a fighting chance. It's the reason we're out here day after day, hours before sunrise. If we don't act, they won't survive.
The Klamath Basin was the largest wetland complex in the western United States. It's a huge area covered with shallow lakes, marshes, creeks, rivers, riparian areas. This was a wet area. 350,000 acres, that's a lot of ground.
It was a naturally balanced system where the groundwater was able to recharge with surface water, and it was a huge oasis for water birds, which use this area as a staging ground in their migration.
It was the focal point of the entire Pacific Flyway. 80–90% of all the migratory birds came through the basin, depended on it. Had the third largest salmon run on the west coast after the Columbia and the Sacramento.
The Klamath Basin had a lot of water. It was a landscape that was rich in water resources. The soils were conducive to farming and grazing livestock and growing forage. And so people started moving into this landscape to establish communities and make the most of the natural resources. As water was controlled and manipulated, a lot of the habitat changed. Wetlands were converted to ag production, and you lost habitat for a lot of species.
Historically, there are multiple big lakes in the area. There's Upper Klamath Lake, and there's Lower Klamath Lake and Tule Lake, and those were huge hotspots for birds. And now the Lower Klamath Lakes have dried up to the point where they're unrecognizable to what they used to be.
Drought and climate change conditions in California and Oregon and many places in the West have exacerbated the loss of wetlands. There's not a lot of wetlands left, and if those are drying up, there's no habitat for these birds that they need to complete these migrations and survive.
Okay, I've got the collar. Let's go open some nets. So we're setting up mist nets out in a marsh that's full of bulrush, and the water level is just about an inch, which all makes it perfect for dowitchers, which we're targeting right now since we're trying to catch them as soon as they start making their first movements of the day. It's just caught in that pin feather there. Okay, I'm gonna walk back with this bird and start processing it. So, this is a long-billed dowitcher. First, I'm gonna band this bird with a USGS metal leg band, and then I'll take a few different measurements to figure out the sex and the weight of the bird. I'm fitting this satellite transmitter right now to the dowitcher. Our transmitters are satellite trackers that can transmit as long as they're getting charged from their tiny solar panel.
Tracking the long-billed dowitchers is pretty important because they're stopping at a lot of historic and current stopover sites. We want to know where they go from their migration in the Arctic to Oregon to the Central Valley and even further south than that.
The Upper Klamath Basin fills a lot of the life cycle needs of different water birds. It's a stopover site during fall and spring migration. We have breeding birds, we have molting birds. There's a lot of different habitat needs that this basin provides for.
This bird is pretty close to completion of its molting process. It has to finish growing these secondary feathers in here, which aren't fully grown yet. Birds work their feathers really hard, so it's really important they make fresh feathers that are as efficient at flying as possible.
Well, one thing that's interesting about long-billed dowitchers is they molt through their migration while they're migrating, which is atypical of most species. That's because the molt takes a lot of energy to lose and create new feathers, as well as migrating takes a lot of energy.
I'm gonna check the amount of fat on the bird. The amount of fat the bird has on its body is a metric to show how fit it is right now, how healthy it is right now, since it's going through so much. And this bird has a little bit of fat under the wing pit, which is great to see. That means they like this permanent wetland.
Generally, the birds would want to have pretty much all of their fat for their journey before they leave. But those sites are being damaged, so they're stopping over at sites. They'll eat for maybe a couple days to a couple weeks. They'll try to rebuild that fat, but if these sites are destroyed or they're diminished in some way, they cannot restore that fat. They won't be able to make it to their next point, and they will probably be injured, they'll get sick, or they'll be predated on because they just can't go anymore. They're out of fuel.
When the water changes just the slightest amount and the wetland becomes too dry or the water becomes too deep, they disappear and they leave the marsh sounding so empty. That sound has been on this landscape for millions of years. And what does it do if that's gone? I don't want to find out.
Dowitchers are a good indicator species for how other shorebirds are doing and where other shorebirds are moving, especially in response to drought conditions or just changing environmental conditions in general. So you can kind of gauge the greater shorebird community to a degree off of the dowitchers.
We're monitoring dowitchers and shorebirds as a way to understand what's going on with the health of wetlands and how wetlands are changing. And understanding what's happening with wetlands is also an indicator of what's going on with the rest of the ecosystem.
Long-term survivorship of these dowitchers and other shorebirds out here is going to depend on land protection first and foremost, but along with protecting that land, we need to make sure that the water is there so these wetlands are viable for these birds to survive.
This isn't a natural wetland in the sense that we created it, but we're using natural processes. And there's been a lot of science figuring out how to do that. And a lot of that has to do with where the water is at certain times of the year. We got shorebirds in here, we got waterfowl, we got all kinds of things dependent on this vegetation. Interestingly, when this floods and the vegetation starts to rot, all these invertebrates come in, and that's what the migratory shorebirds are totally going after. They're just begging to be restored. We put water on that thing, and there were wetland plants in there within 6 months. 18 months later, it looks like a marsh. We didn't plant a seed. The seed bank is there. All you got to do is add water. And that can happen all across the basin.
Our best shot at solving the water challenges in this basin is to try to make the most of the limited water we have. How do we enhance wetlands in a way that improves water quality, that works in sync with agricultural production, that provides habitat? How do we enhance wetlands to store water and make this whole basin more resilient?
Wetlands are what drove this system. They're the fundamental piece of the ecosystem. And without them, the system doesn't work. So to get the ecosystem working again in such a way that you can support a really healthy ag economy, healthy ranching economy, you have to have wetlands on the landscape. And we're not going to go back to 1860, but we can make it rhyme. We got to make it rhyme with what used to be here.
Ultimately, for this to be successful, we're going to have to get everyone with an interest at the table. Public landowners, private landowners, farmers, tribes, and all the agencies that have an interest so we can share these resources and have a sustainable future.
In the end of the day, it's just restoring these places. And it doesn't have to be everywhere. I mean, there's hundreds of dowitchers right here.
So success in the Klamath Basin is about restoring the hydrology where we can in a way that makes the basin more resilient to drought and climate change. And I think that's good for people, that's good for birds like dowitchers, and for fish and other wildlife.
I'm like everybody else. I read the newspaper and it's like, oh my God, another wildfire, another drought, another horrible thing going on. Well, this is an opportunity to fix it. We can actually get this whole system working again. We can get the waterfowl back. We can get the salmon back. We can get the quam and cockatoo back. It's doable.